And now on to today's talk. We are visited by Peter Fazekas, who is a fellow at the AIAS. Peter has a really interesting background in philosophy and philosophy of cognitive science. He has moved between UCL, working with David Papineau, who is kind of a very, in a sense, traditional philosopher. Then he went to Edinburgh, worked with Andy Clark, works on extended mind, then to Antwerpen, and currently he is a fellow at the IS on this problem that explores mind wandering and its relevance, among other things, for creativity. Creativity is, at least on paper, the theme for the IMC activities this term here. We have been fairly uncreative in actually getting it on the agenda. My COVID experience has been one where whenever you try to do something, it just stops. It is as if inertia has kicked up. And that's certainly not good for creativity because it keeps or needs an even larger push than usual to actually be able to open up these spaces that allows them to happen. Maybe there is something about too little mind wandering that goes on right now, but I think, Peter, you might be able to tell us more about that during your talk.
I
Great to
see.
have you here, and please take us away.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just share the screen. Can you see my slides? At least the first page? Yeah, good. Excellent. Thanks a lot. So thanks a lot for this opportunity. Yeah, and it's working. So I'm an incoming fellow at the Institute of Advanced Studies. In fact, I just started last week. So my main goal with this presentation is to introduce myself by talking about my project at AIAS, which focuses on mind wandering. And I would also like to talk about the connection between mind wandering and creativity, since creativity, as Anders mentioned, is a focus point currently at IMC. So some parts of the work that I will talk about during this presentation are collaborative efforts. And my partners in crime are Georgian Nemeth, who is currently a visiting postdoc at CFIN, and Morten Overgaard, who is a professor at CFIN. So this is the plan of my talk. First, I'd like to set the stage by introducing what mind wandering is and what the most influential theoretical approaches are. Next, I will argue that none of these approaches are able to provide a satisfactory picture about the nature of mind wandering, and I will try to convince you that a certain type of new approach is needed that is able to combine different aspects of existing theoretical frameworks. And finally, I will go deeper into what we know about how episodes of mind wandering are generated, maintained, and directed, and show how all this is related to creativity. Now, mind wandering is the familiar phenomenon when the contents of your stream of consciousness dynamically change, often to elements which are not directly related either to the actual sensory stimuli coming from your environment or to the goals that you're trying to achieve. So imagine that you are working towards some goal indicated as an X on this illustration that requires some mental effort, but not too much. I will come back to this aspect later. Then what you would typically experience is that seemingly random content starts popping up in your mind. Like, for example, have I locked my car? Ooh, look at those orange trousers. My daughter would love those. Or maybe like, I wonder what life would be if we had a dog. These are instances of mind wandering which occur surprisingly regularly. So according to some estimations, mind wandering occupies almost half of our wakeful mental life. So what is mind wandering and why our brain is doing it? Here is an illustration of how mind wandering is typically studied and operationalized in the lab. So you're given a cognitively undemanding task, and then semi-random thought probes ask you to reflect on what was going on in your mind when the probe occurred. Now, traditionally in the literature, there are two different ideas that have been used to operationalize mind wandering. The first one says that a thought is a case of mind wandering if it is not stimulus driven. So if your thought is internally generated, or as it often put, self-generated, then it counts as an instance of mind wandering. The second idea links mind wandering to the task itself. It says that the crucial characteristic that defines mind wandering is that it is not related to the task that you are working on. The problem with these two definitions, or different strategies, is that they both are built on equally strong intuitions. So just because a thought is stimulus independent, it might not be judged intuitively as an instance of mind wandering, since it very well might be about an ongoing task, like in this case here in the illustration. And similarly, just because a thought is task unrelated, it still very well might be directly triggered by a perceptual stimulus, in which case people would typically refrain from judging it as an instance of mind wandering. So people started to argue that the best way to characterize mind wandering is stimulus independent and task unrelated thought. So both conditions at the same time must be fulfilled. However, this definition is problematic as well. And understanding what the problem is will take us closer to my own proposal. In short, the problem is that the key concepts that this definition relies on, being stimulus independent and task unrelated, are not well defined. And it is problematic because take stimulus independence first and consider the example, say the orange trousers that I mentioned in the introduction. Let's say I'm walking on the street, I see someone in orange trousers, which make me think about my daughter's dressing habits. I would say that this is an instance of mind wandering, but in the strictest sense of the term, this thought is not stimulus independent, as it has been triggered by a stimulus in my environment. Or again, similar problems arise with task unrelatedness as well. What about long-term tasks and ongoing concerns? If my mind starts wandering, say, while I'm in the middle of reading an article, that would be a case of mind wandering. Let's say it ends up contemplating about having a dog. But it is not task independent in the strictest sense of the term if getting a dog is something that we've been discussing with my family lately, and it's an ongoing concern for me. So considerations like this have led Kalina Christoph at UBC and her team to the conclusion that content-specific features, so what the content of an instance of mind wandering is related to, are not the right kind of characteristics that a definition of mind wandering should rely on. Instead, they propose that what one should focus on is the dynamics of how series of thoughts unfold. The crucial concepts this so-called dynamic view of mind wandering relies on are those of control and constraint. Mind wandering is a type of thinking that is uncontrolled and unconstrained. So here are three insights that describe an example of mind wandering in this unconstrained, also called spontaneous sense, and two contrast cases. So let me walk you through them. So here is mind wandering proper, according to Christoph's dynamic view. While I walk to the grocery store, I daydream about the winter boots I've ordered from an online store, recall that blustery winter when they shut down my elementary school, then envision next weekend's ski trip to Lake Tahoe. So here, there are no constraints. The content of this stream of consciousness freely changed from one topic to another. And also notice that some of these content elements are about the past, some are about the future. Contrast this with the following example, which is just really a continuation of this same stream of consciousness. As I cross the street, I begin to worry about the story that my newspaper editor wants me to write before I leave for Tahoe. Can I submit on time? Will anyone read a piece on trade unions? I picture my scowling editor. Do I even belong here? So in this case, the unfolding of thoughts is constrained by so-called automatic or bottom-up constraints that are not under a deliberate control of the individual, like, for example, sensory, or in this case, emotional salience. So this is what Christoph calls automatically constrained thought. And then here is another contrast case. While I step up the curb, I realize that my thoughts are making me miserable. I decide to think about something else. Where am I heading to? Oh yes, groceries. I imagine myself walking down each grocery aisle. I should get eggs, milk, and lemonade, and so on. You get the idea. So here, the unfolding of thoughts is constrained by deliberate constraints that are purposefully directed, like those, for example, that stem from cognitive representations of task requirements. So a task here is to do the shopping in a grocery store. You can also see in this illustration possible underlying neural mechanisms in terms of the interactions of certain large-scale brain networks. So in this is a really beautiful paper, and Christopher and her colleagues, they're not just catching their new account of mind wandering, but they go through a really thorough overview of what the possible neural underpinnings of these different types of thought, what these underpinnings could be. So the idea is that spontaneous thought is associated with default mode network activity, whereas automatic constraints are implemented by constraints on this default mode network by salience networks, whereas deliberate constraints are implemented by influence by the frontal parietal control network. Now, I think that there are problems with this proposal as well, but before discussing those, I would like to mention another view, which is basically the biggest contender of this dynamic view in contemporary literature. This so-called family resemblance view stems from the very observation that there are many different approaches that try to define what mind wandering might be in really different ways. Crucially, these different approaches often use characterizations that share only some features. On the basis of this observation, Paul Sally and his colleagues proposed that mind wandering might be a phenomenon that cannot be given a simple single feature focused definition. Instead, the concept of mind wandering might be similar to concepts like a chair, where different instances can be more or less prototypical, sharing more or less features. Like chairs usually have 4 legs, something to sit on, maybe a back, but clearly not all chairs have those features. Still, it makes sense to use the term chair, even if its instances cannot be brought under a single definition, but rather are in a family resemblance relation. So the idea is that the same thing applies to mind wandering as well. Some instances of mind wandering are unintentional and unconstrained, whereas other instances can be intentional and, for example, task unrelated. But there is no characterization that could fit all instances. So much for stage setting. So the dynamic and the family resemblance views are the most influential approaches nowadays, and it is actively debated which one has an edge over the other. I think that both have managed to point out something fundamental about mind wandering, but I also think that neither of them is the view to follow. Instead, I propose a new approach which can be seen as an attempt to reconcile these two frameworks. So let me start with what I think is problematic with the dynamic view. Recall that the dynamic view creates a really close link between mind wandering and a special type of the dynamics of thought, namely an unconstrained and uncontrolled unfolding. In general terms, the problem with the dynamic view is that this strong association between mind wandering and lack of control does not stand up to scrutiny. There are examples of dissociation in both ways. So here's an example of a kind of dynamics which the dynamic view identifies as the main characteristic of mind wandering, but in a case which is intuitively something that we wouldn't want to call mind wandering. So consider the case when salient external stimuli catch the attention of individuals with ADHD, whose attention then moves freely from one stimulus to another in an unguided, uncontrolled fashion. So the dynamics is very similar to what the dynamic view describes as the main characteristic of mind wandering. Yet the stream of consciousness is entirely stimulus driven. Recall that this is one of the strong intuitions behind the original definitions of mind wandering, or at least the original attempts, that we don't want to count something as mind wandering if it is entirely stimulus driven. Second, here is another example for the other case where which intuitively would count as an instance of mind wandering, yet the dynamics of thought involved is very different. So consider being in your office, surrounded by your colleagues, yet being lost in your thoughts, centered around a story that gradually evolves as new and new content elements pop into your mind without you actively directing your thought. In such cases, there are no totally unconstrained shifts in thought, as you would feel a strong urge to guide your attention away from content elements not belonging to the story when they pop into your mind, maintaining the storyline in an intentional fashion. An extreme example of this case can be so-called maladaptive daydreaming, when these episodes are so vivid that one gets lost in them, entirely spending hours and hours daydreaming. So again, this is, or people argue that this is an instance of mind wandering, yet there is no sign of the kind of uncontrolled unfolding that the dynamic view is talking about. So on the basis of these considerations, I think that the dynamic view is mistaken in claiming that it is only the dynamics of thought that matters. I think that many other features matter as well. Yet there is something that I think the dynamic view gets right. It is the idea that an account of mind wandering needs to identify dimensions along which thoughts can change. So here's an illustration from the original article by Christopher and colleagues. I think they're right about talking about dimensions of automatic constraints and deliberate constraints and continuous changing content along these dimensions. It's just that automatic and deliberate constraints are not the only dimensions that need to be taken into account. My project analyzes all the other factors that, for example, the family resemblance view acknowledges as attributes of different varieties of mind wandering as well. So how is my approach different from the family resemblance view then? Well, the family resemblance view thinks that there are different instances of the general phenomenon mind wandering that are fully characterized by certain subsets of all features that have been used in the literature. So for example, here's a subset, intentional, unintentional, task unrelated. And that these features are mostly dichotomous, like a chair either has a back or it doesn't. It either has a surface affording sitting or it doesn't. But that is not the case with mind wandering. Mind wandering is not either intentional or unintentional. There are different degrees of intentionality that might be involved. Similarly, there might be different levels of task relatedness and stimulus independence, just like there can be different levels of constraint involved. All these factors form at least quasi-continuous dimensions that mind wandering can change along. Related, it is not true that some instances can be fully characterized by a subset of these features. In case of dichotomous features that either apply or don't, you can have subsets, those that apply. So again, in this case, this subset applies, all the other features don't apply to this instance, according to Sally. But in the case of quasi-continuous features, it always makes sense to ask which region of those feature dimensions apply to a given instance. So my proposal, and it happens to be in line with some recent findings, is that all these factors form dimensions such that mind wandering can be characterized by a certain range of the values along these dimensions. So the level of intentionality involved is a dimension. Here is a paper, ironically by Sally himself, arguing for the same thing. The level of stimulus independence is a dimension. The level of task unrelatedness is a dimension as well. The level of content variability is a dimension. The level of vividness of the content elements is another dimension. You get the idea, yes. Interestingly, this multidimensional framework can also tell us important things about how mind wandering is related to other types of phenomena, like how it can change so it becomes rumination or classical goal-directed thought or dreaming and hallucinations. Now, these transitions from mind wandering to dreaming and hallucinations along the intensification of the vividness of the content elements and certain changes in the front of the brain are the topics that I have recently worked on. But that's not what I would like to talk about today. Today, I would like to focus on two other dimensions. First, the dimension that I would like to talk about is the content variability dimension. Content variability means basically semantic or episodic distance, the extent to which consecutive mental states are episodically or semantically distinct from each other. It is an interesting dimension because here, so to speak, slip into rumination territory, you can find a region that can say a lot about dysfunctional kinds of mind wandering and consequently about the possible function of mind wandering. But today I'm more interested in the other end of this spectrum, this region here. First, let me just make a quick remark about the possible neural basis of conscious experiences. Recall that instances of mind wandering are episodes within the stream of consciousness. These are perception-like and thought-like conscious experiences that presumably have the same neural basis as all other perception-like and thought-like experiences. Well, in fact, recent discoveries indicating that the content of perception or working memory or mental imagery and even dreaming and hallucinations are all subserved by the same brain regions. In the case of perceptual experiences, this region towards the back of the head is dubbed posterior Hudson by Melanie Bowley. This is important because the question in this section, the question that I would like to ask in this section, focuses on the generation of mind wandering, which is basically a question about the mechanism that can give rise to the neocortical neurorepresentations that underlie instances of mind wandering experiences. As it turns out, there are three different sources of mind wandering experiences. First, some are stimulus driven, either in the direct or indirect sense, that the underlying neurorepresentations are triggered by stimulus-induced sensory representations, in the indirect case via associative links. Second, some are goal or concern directed, in the sense that they are triggered, sometimes only indirectly, by cognitive representations of task requirements. And third, some are originated in the medial temporal lobe, particularly the hippocampus. Recently, McCormick and colleagues compared the mind wandering of individuals with and without hippocampal damage. They found that hippocampal damage did not affect the frequency of mind wandering, only its content. With intact hippocampus, The content of mind wandering is of high variability, and it is often past or future oriented, involving reconstructions of past experiences and constructions of novel simulations as well. With hippocampal damage, the content of mind wandering is restricted to the here and now and is typically stimulus driven or goal directed. So what is responsible for the high variability, which is sometimes also called the hyperassociativity of mind wandering, is this third source that is centered around the medial temporal lobe subsystem of the default mode network, especially the hippocampus. Well, the involvement of the hippocampus in generating the content of mind wandering is not surprising at all. It is well known that besides its role in memory, the hippocampus also plays a crucial role in imagery and creating future-oriented simulations. According to the so-called component process model, memory traces are encoded in ensembles of neurons distributed throughout the neocortex. Hippocampal representations have an indexing function such that they are able to reactivate the ensembles that were active during the original experience. Cues, even partial cues, can rapidly and often unconsciously trigger the activation of hippocampal representations, which then activate the ensembles that they index. This process is called pattern completion. The hippocampus also implements another mechanism called pattern separation that creates separate indices. So these are supposed to be neocortical representations, and these are supposed to be representations in the hippocampus. So this other mechanism implemented by the hippocampus, the pattern separation, it creates separate indices to similar input patterns, decorrelating the activity patterns of parts of episodic memories. And as a result, parts of complex past experiences can be activated separately, which creates the foundation for complex new simulation. Now, pattern separation and pattern completion together provide the mechanistic basis of continuously generated, highly variable mental content. The idea is that memories recalled during pattern completion might provide partial or degraded cues that may then trigger further pattern completions, which then trigger further pattern completion, and so on, thus facilitating a continuous change in mental contents. Right, so next, and this is the last bit of the puzzle, let me briefly talk about another dimension, the level of intentionality involved in mind wandering. So very briefly, it is known that intentionality and its involvement in mind wandering is underlined by frontoparietal control, by the frontoparietal control network, and that mind wandering with higher levels of intentionality are associated with increased activity in the frontoparietal control network, as well as with heightened functional connectivity between executive and default regions. Okay, so here is a two-dimensional subspace of the multi-dimensional conceptual space that I have argued for as the best characterization of mind wandering. So I'm just focusing on these two dimensions that I mentioned, content variability and intentional involvement. According to this approach, mind wandering episodes are trajectories in this state space. They consist in a sequence of third-like and perceptual-like experiences that can first be, say, highly variable with a low level of intentional involvement, but then one kind of content element can capture attention in a way that triggers a higher level of intention that can then lead to lower content variability, and so on. Why is this interesting over and above the fact that this is a new model of how to think about mind wandering? Well, from a certain perspective, that's a reason good enough, but there is more. What I have been talking about so far, and this is something that I try to argue in the rest of the talk, can shed new light on the relationship between mind wandering and creativity. How am I doing? Yeah. We know at least since 2012, since the publication of this beautiful paper by Benjamin Baird and his colleagues, that mind wandering has an effect on creativity. First, the study provides preliminary evidence that individuals who mind wander more frequently, usually in their daily lives, may be more creative in general. Second, the study demonstrates that incubation effects, so improvement of the performance they used an unusual uses task. So when you're given an object and you have to come up within a given period of time, some unusual uses of that object were larger. So the improvement was larger when individuals engaged in undemanding tasks that are known to facilitate mind wandering. So you have 4 conditions. First, you're given an unusual uses task, and either you are asked to do it again right away, that's the no break condition, or you are asked to have an incubation period with just normal rest, or you're given a task, either a cognitively demanding task or a cognitively undemanding task. And there's plenty of evidence showing that, interestingly, it's not the rest period which gives rise to the most mind-wandering episodes, but when you have to do something which is not cognitively demanding. So when you are working on a cognitively undemanding task, those are the cases when the most thoughts will just pop into your mind, which are not related to the task or to your environment. And what they found is that those individuals who engaged in this kind of task during the incubation period were much better on the second trial in the unusual uses task than those in the other groups. So there is a clear association between mind wandering and creative performance. This is interesting because it seems now that mind wandering has a positive effect on creativity. And for a long time, mind wandering had been associated with purely negative effects. Negative effects on attention, negative effects on task performance, and so on. There is even a whole branch of popular psychology that offers certain kinds of mindfulness exercises to keep your mind wanderings under control. But it seems that mind wandering does have positive effects as well. For example, it fosters creativity. So what factor could underlie this link? What feature of mind wandering is able to exert such a positive effect on creativity? Well, first, as a first step, Baird and his colleagues, at the end of this paper, proposed that individual differences in mind wandering and creativity might be related. What can underline that relationship? Well, I think that the framework that I have presented is able to shed new light on the nature of this relationship. First, consider that according to our best account of what creativity is, it consists in 2 processes: a creative idea generation process or phase, and an evaluation phase. And as I'm sure that many of you are aware of it, the neural correlates of these 2 processes are very similar to those neural mechanisms that underlie highly variable content generation during mind wandering and the involvement of intention in mind wandering, respectively. So medial temporal lobe and hippocampus activity in the case of creative idea generation, and increased recruitment of executive networks and increased coupling between executive networks and the medial temporal lobe in the evaluation phase. This significant overlap between their neural correlates gestures towards the possibility that creative thinking is just a special type of mind wandering with a specific kind of trajectory, such that the mind in this multi-dimensional space, such that the mind spends a lot of time in the high content variability, low intentionality region, in the so-called idea generation phase. And then sometime in the high intentionality, low content variability region during the evaluation phase. And then it can start again. So the moral is that creativity is not a special faculty possessed only by artists and inventors, but it is the very same faculty that generates normal everyday mind wanderings. A truly creative idea is the product of the same default generative capacity of the mind that is also responsible for everyday off-topic thoughts popping into your mind, or for those rigid and repetitive thoughts that can occur in psychiatric conditions. Creative individuals are simply those who can somehow harness this default generative capacity and can produce ideas that are more useful either for their own purposes or, in ideal cases, for the entire society. That's it. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Peter. Wonderful talk, really precise, and so much of the critical literature covered. The talk is open for questions and discussions. Please raise your hand in the Zoom window so we can see who is doing it, and I just need to reorganize my screen so I can see you as well. Yep. Who wants to open the discussion? Yes.
Yeah, thanks for a really interesting talk. I think one thing I'm a bit missing here, especially with the family resemblance models, is what is actually tying. It seems to be there is a lot of phenomena that you want to group under this concept of mind wandering, and it might even be distinct physical phenomena and different brain phenomena for that matter. So I think and maybe I just missed it, but what is it that is sort of binding it all together to being one phenomena to investigate, if that makes sense?
Right. So yes, thank you very much. Actually, that's a very, very good question. So interestingly, well, maybe not interestingly, since mind wandering is a relatively new focus of psychological research. So as you might know, that it has been relegated to what some call the backfooters of psychological investigation, since the focus was on task-related and stimulus-related mental phenomena. Recently, it got to center stage, and the interesting part, and the main reason why this is a very exciting area, both from a theoretical perspective and even for a philosopher, is exactly because there are huge debates about the fundamental concepts that should be used. So people working in this area, they kind of agree that there are some intuitive guidelines that help you decide whether a certain instance of mental phenomenon is an instance of mind wandering or not. And they try to come up with the best kinds of I can't pronounce that word right now. So the best way of defining that phenomena in a way that can capture all intuitive cases. So in a sense, your question just goes into the heart of this very problem that the whole field is struggling with. And there is no good answer to that yet. That's why there can be so huge differences than one group is claiming that there is this single phenomenon that can underline mind wandering, and the other group is saying that no, it's not that another feature should be in the focus, but there are no possibility of giving a single feature-based definition. There's a huge differences. Why? Exactly because of what you're pointing at, that the first group is just looking at a subset of all the related mental phenomena, while the other group wants to say that no, it's a much broader range of this set of mental phenomena that should be taken into account. So yeah, good question, but I unfortunately I don't have a good answer to that.
Ben?
Well, thank you for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. I'm intrigued by your use of this multidimensional way of describing mind wandering, and I wonder if it's only a conceptual framework, or can it also be used to analyze how people actually move around within these multidimensional trajectories? I mean, are you able to measure that somehow using experience sampling or maybe even some kind of scanning technology?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's also a perfect question, exactly because not yet. I don't have anything to say about that yet. So far, it's a conceptual framework, but that's exactly the purpose of the project that I will do here in the next 3 years, to try to figure that out, whether I can somehow show, using experiments, that these dimensions are really there, and people are able, people's thoughts are able to move along these dimensions, and that can be measured by certain thought probes or using known neural underpinnings, maybe other techniques like EEG.
And then on to Carsten, who is doing work not so much on the brain, but really on search processes and the links to creativity.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for your talk, Peter. I like many of your visualizations. They're really very useful for understanding what's going on. I was wondering, sort of just a broad open question, do you have any thoughts on if mind wandering is particularly related to sort of radical novelty versus incremental novelty? Can we expect something, especially in innovation literature, we talk about radical innovation versus incremental innovation, but I guess that also applies to creativity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that it is something that, maybe it helps if I go to that illustration, which is not mine, but where is it? Sorry, it's just the last one, so I have to go through it. Oh no. So I start talking while I'm doing this. So, well, I think, yeah, here we are. I think that what you are asking about is this dimension, which is supposed to be a dimension that Fox and Beatty defines. So this is not the same as the level of intentionality or content variability. This is about the novelty and usefulness of the thoughts that come up either during mind wandering. So Fox is someone who's working on mind wandering, and Beatty is someone who's working on creativity, or the creative idea generation phase of creative thinking. So the idea is that the same mechanism can give rise to certain thoughts which can be incrementally novel or incrementally useful for you or for the task that you're dealing with. Sometimes this is the case, most of the times, what they call normal adults. And in creative individuals, the novelty of the thoughts that are generated by this process are typically higher on average than those that are created in normal individuals. I don't know, maybe that might be an answer to you, especially if I understand it correctly.
Yeah, if I can elaborate, I was sort of more thinking of within subject. Would the same subject that is sort of led to mind wandering, would that lead to more novelty? Yeah, so what kind of novelty would it lead to, sort of within the same subject? Can we expect this to actually, I guess this is maybe what your graph is illustrating, this can be expected to lead to highly creative thoughts and not just incremental novelty? Okay,
yes, it can, but yeah.
And then if I can just make one very small short question, do you know of the number reduction task? Is that something you've stumbled upon?
No.
Okay, I was just curious.
Then I put myself on the list here. I mean, the whole story about the default network and how it came to be discovered is, of course, deeply interesting, right? That at first it was something that was, so to say, discovered by chance because someone tried to look at the opposite contrast between task and no task. And it turned out that this network just seemed to be active again and again. And there were a lot of discussions during the early 2000s about whether this was a spurious finding related to circulation or other things, or whether indeed some kind of neural processing seems to be going on. And as you were saying, just as you kind of have shifted it from being something that seems to be an artifact, just like mind wandering might be, a lot of people now want to, at least in the neurocognitive literature, to assign a lot of important and critical functions to activities in the default mode network. Now, I wonder for you as a philosopher, in a sense, thinking through these problems about creativity through the landscape of neuroscience, is that kind of adding something to the basic discussions by going through the neuroscientific literature? Or is it really more a matter of, so to say, by inserting novel ideas or deep ideas about what creativity is, what human mind might be about, that we can come to reinterpret stuff from the neural literature that you don't discover there in the first place? So why would you as a philosopher really care about the neural activations?
Oh, that's a really deep question. But I think that both of the things that you mentioned are correct in one sense or another. So when you're doing philosophy, then it's often the case that there are long-standing debates in philosophy which really can be resolved if you look into the brain and look how things really happen there. That can be illuminating. There are many cases where when philosophical debates could be moved forward because of that. So that's certainly true. The way you frame your question was more about me, and my personal interest is not necessarily about advancing certain philosophical debates. So although I do have background in philosophy, but I do have background in cognitive science as well, and I'm more interested in these questions from the perspective of theoretical cognitive science, so to speak. So yeah, that's why that's why I say that both of the options that you offered have some truth.
Which is perfectly valid, of course. And I guess what we have seen over the last years is that this field between, you can say, experimental thinking and theoretical thinking turns into a very creative hybrid space where a lot of things can actually be tried out that are relevant of both sides. And I think your talk is a great example of that. Michaela, you're next.
Yes, thank you. I like to hear from someone saying that creativity doesn't belong to very few people somewhere on a higher hierarchy, but in the general literature or in the mainstream literature on creativity, it is like that. You need the third person perspective or the experts to say who is a creative person. So when you make this connection between mind wandering and creativity and say that they are on a continuum of process, do you also take into account something that is evaluated by others, by the society and stuff like that? Where would you put that in your model? Or
I see. I think I understand. That's a great question. I think that I just have the right illustration for this, because here. So when these ideas are evaluated, and again, what you're evaluating are the novelty and the usefulness in certain situations when you want to do something, either as an artist or as an inventor, that you have very specific goals that you want to achieve. So there are good measures of usefulness. It can be done by you, but it can also be done by the society. The society, other people can decide whether the ideas that you come up with are useful or not. And so it can be a sense of, or it can be something similar to what I understand you're talking about when others judge whether you are creative or not.
And then we have a question from Clara Kreuer, who for some reason can't raise her hand on the screen. But please, Clara, take us away.
Thank you. I'm just, thanks for the talk, first of all. I'm just really curious about the relationship between creativity and intentionality that you talk about. And that sort of spectrum. And I don't know, because you had a slide about it, and I just, I'm interested because now Michaela talked about more of an external view of creativity. whereas you talk about creativity and mind wandering as being sort of two sides of the same coin. And I was just wondering, because you can have an intention of being creative, or sort of, you know, working within a creative space. So just how you view that distinction between like involuntary, I don't know if you can call it that, but like the mind wandering and the intentional creative space that you try to find yourself in every once in a while.
Right. Thanks for this question. So it allows me to elaborate on this point, and I think it's important, because the kind of intentionality that I'm talking about is not about wanting to be creative. So it's not that, okay, I sit down and I decide that I come up with good ideas now. It's more like the kind of intentionally involved. When I talk about the level of intentionally involved in mind wandering, what I mean is that, okay, let me just make one step back. It's easier to start if I just talk about 3 phases of mind wandering. So you can generate content, the content of mind wandering. You can maintain certain content elements, and then you can switch to other content elements. And when you voluntarily try to come up with something, so when deliberation plays a role in generation, that is often not called mind wandering. It would be a case of voluntary mental imagery, for example, which is typically something that people would, again, that along the lines that I sketched, would not judge intuitively as a case of mind wandering. So intentionality here plays a role in maintaining the thought. So recall the example that I talked about, when you're sitting in your office and you're evolving a story in your mind. You don't want to tell to yourself what to imagine. That and your story can really evolve in ways that can surprise you. But what you're doing intentionally, can you hear me? Because I had a notification that my connection went down.
Yes.
Okay. So, but what you can do intentionally is that you maintain this story, so to speak. So you voluntarily reject those content elements that pop into your mind that wouldn't fit into the story. This way, you just keep the flow of your thoughts without determining the actual content elements.
Yeah, so it's more like a state of mind you choose to be in. Yeah.
And it's definitely not something like sitting down and trying to come up with something new, or telling yourself what to imagine. You can do those things. I mean, I'm not sure whether you can do the first thing, but you can do the second thing. But that's again, that would be a case of voluntary mental imagery.
Thank you.
Yeah, Carolina?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. What I'm wondering about is how the similarities that you notice between mind wandering and creativity can impact how we understand and measure creativity in a new way. I feel like the idea that divergent thinking involves generation of multiple ideas is sort of already there. And what I'm thinking is, how could we use this very interesting idea you have about the similarities between the two constructs in how we define and understand creativity? Because there are quite a lot of definitions out there, and it's a very big mixed field, as you know. So it's just something I'm wondering about.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it's a great question, and I'm sorry to say, but I'm not the right person, at least yet, to answer that. I'm coming from the mind wandering side of the coin, and so the creativity literature is the new thing for me. I'm working myself into it, but I'm simply just not able to answer that question. But that's again something that the project is about, and I hope that at one point, at least, I will be able to provide some answer.
So, Peter, a question following up a little bit on Clara's comments. So I guess the mind-wandering view on creativity would be part of a larger family that says that part of creativity is to get into a stage that, so to say, opens up for a search process that gets you out of a local minimum that you're somehow trapped in, right? And the mind wandering might be one way of doing it. The work that Carsten Berkenholz is doing, it has another formalization from it, etc. And I think there is a lot of work that has much research going for it these days to say that to be creative means somehow to, insert, metaphorically speaking, energy into the dynamic system. So whatever valley you're caught in, you can exit from it and other opportunities open up. But I wonder, because another strain that goes along that line would be Csikszentmihalyi's ideas about flow, or at the IMC, we have someone like Mark Anderson who works on play. And I think what they would both be suggesting is that things like flow or processes of play are about, in a sense, bringing yourself into a state that allows for surprises to happen, that allows for these search processes to go on by themselves. Mm-hmm. But I would say that neither flow nor play is characterized by mind wandering. If anything, it's almost the absolute opposite. It's about being completely absorbed in something that does have an internal logic that you're not in control of, but it doesn't seem to relate to the mind wandering aspect of it. So if we go with that line, would you say that, let's say, the playfulness or the flow way of generating creativity, would that be orthogonal to the mind wandering aspect? Are they completely unrelated? Are they somehow part of the same framework?
That's a very interesting question. Honestly, I've never thought about this, but now that you're mentioning it, what comes to mind is that I have two kids, and the older one is 8, and we often play together with many things, for example, with Lego blocks. But my experience is that play is an essential example of the kind of undemanding cognitive task, which is very strongly associated with mind wandering. We can have beautiful mind wanderings together. I mean, verbalizing them and if letting the story evolve in a common activity. So again, this is not, I haven't given any serious thought to this, but just at the intuitive level or what first comes to mind, I do see a connection with mind wandering and play. And I certainly see some connections between the kind of low cognitive demand tasks that are given to foster mind wandering and the kind of situations that you engage with when you when you play. So I would say, again, this is something that I need to think about, but I would say that I see a connection. So I wouldn't say that, at least now, that those are two different things. That might be two sources of creative idea generation. I would rather go for trying to figure out the place of play on that same continuum.
Great. Any other questions or suggestions or ideas you want to share? And then remember, Peter is going to, yeah, Ida?
I am a bit curious about the slides you had about the creativity and mind wandering inter-individually. And you said you had this picture that in one end there were the very creative people, and then the other end of the mind wandering scale there were the people that in some way have a lot of rumination and the psychiatric population. And then I was wondering if you know anything about the traditional idea that of the suffering artist, where I think that often those two would be combined, that the suffering artist has some internalized problems, but it's also very creative. So would it be, as I see this model, they are kind of split apart instead of set together in one population?
Okay, so if I understand it correctly, what you're asking is, well, is a situation when a certain individual is sometimes at around this end of the spectrum and in other times around the other end of the spectrum, right? Yes, certainly. That I think I haven't answered that. There was a previous question about individual, differences within the individual, and yes, that can certainly happen. So it's not it's not the case that certain individuals always produce highly useful thoughts and are always here towards this end of the spectrum. So as this shows as well, although this is talking about groups of people, it can happen within the individual as well, that when someone, say an artist, is stuck with his or her process, then that's exactly because the dynamics of the unfolding of his or her thoughts is such that he or she is stuck in that region of this conceptual space where only those kind of thoughts pop into his or her mind, which have a very low novelty and very low usefulness, maybe repetitive thoughts, and so such thoughts that are really reminiscent of those that one can have in psychotic conditions.
Yeah, Clara?
Yes, my hand works now. No, it was just a comment on the play and mind wandering, because I thought that was very interesting. And I was just wondering if you could look at it like sort of like play being an sort of externalization or an embodiment of mind wandering, in a sense that you saw, because mind wandering is kind of like internal. So it's something that happens within you or like in your head. And then you have play, which is more like an outwards thing where you interact, so you can look at it and maybe, I don't know if that's possible to incorporate in your sort of framework, but the idea of having something that's very much turned inwards, and then you have something that is more outwards, but it's sort of the same mechanism of, you know, the flow or whatever it is you call it, but it's just happening in different spaces, in a sense, if that makes sense.
I absolutely, I like that idea very much. Again, when I answered to the related question previously, I mentioned that I've never thought about this. It was just an instant idea, but now that you have formulated it in such a big way, I totally agree. That's something what I had in mind. I just couldn't put it into words in such a great way. But yeah, thanks.
So Clara, the notion of play as 4E mind wandering is a really, really cool one. Yeah, Michaela?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm still having this idea of, in creativity literature, you have to have these people who say, this is a good idea, or this is not a good idea. Sometimes you also can realize for yourself if you're a creative individual or not, or you have a creative idea or not. And related to what Ida also said, so you said that you have a continuum mind wandering, and then at one end is pathological, and in one end is something that is beneficial for the society. So is it that I'm mind wandering and I have to be evaluated by someone to tell me that I'm creative or not? Or I can be creative without someone telling me that I'm creative?
Well, the way I think about it, and the way those think about it who created this illustration, is neutral with regard to whether it is you who is doing the evaluation or the society or a certain group of people. So you can be creative, even if you're just on your own and you're evaluating your thoughts and you want to solve something and you find the right solution on the basis of a previous idea generation phase. Certainly you can be creative. There might be a separate phenomenon when a part of the society calls you a creative person, and maybe they have a list of reasons to base their judgment on, but that's just another case of evaluation done by others, not by you.
But what is the difference then between mind wandering, for instance, in schizophrenia, and then in normal population? Like maybe a schizophrenic person thinks that all the ideas that they do are very creative, and other people say, well, this is just rubbish, this is not useful for anything, blah blah blah. So where do we put a society somehow in, like the ones who have to decide what is creative and useful?
Okay, so I think I now understand what your question is, and then So if you want to find a role for society here, then I would say that, yes, I agree that even someone towards this end of the spectrum can sometimes have the personal feeling that he or she has creative ideas. When the society or the part of society judges you creative, then what they do is that, again, this is something that like just comes to mind instinctively right now. I haven't thought about these questions before, but I think right now is that what happens there is that they evaluate whether the ideas that you come up with are useful from the perspective of a grander goal that the society invests in, for example. And that can be totally separate. That can be a totally separate question from the question that the individual is interested in, whether personal goal can be solved by an idea that he or she comes up with. So it can be the case that the individual thinks that I'm creative, yet the society decides that, okay, this is not useful for us. But again, I'm saying this without any knowledge of this part of the literature.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to insist on this.
Patricia?
Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for the nice talk. I would just like to add something for in my Miaela like discussion, is that there are plenty of theories about creativity, and we are way we are in a long way to find out what is creativity, what are the neural processes involved during the creative process. But there is this little c and big C creativity, where it could be like something that you develop for yourself, and you, at the end of the day, you think like, okay, for example, as scientists, we look at the data and we find a novel way to look at the data. So that is, at the end of the day, I think, okay, I was creative. Or to the society, right? That you find like the cure for the cancer, and you had a big impact on creativity. But I also wanted to add in this figure, because I did my PhD on musical creativity, and I also discussed a bit of the impact of autist individuals and creativity, because sometimes we think about the repetitive thoughts and all the familiarity, and the use of the same thoughts don't lead us to be creative. But in autism, for example, and most of you at IMC know this better than me, they use a lot of repetitive patterns, but at the same time, like every time they have a new stimuli input, they see it as a novel. So they are able to combine what they saw before in a novel way. So I don't actually agree with this plot from Betty and Fox, but there is plenty of research, Peter, on that, and the psychiatry and the mad creative individual that is not mad, and the societal impact, and so on. And one of the things that I would also like to add as a population that I think it's a good way to study is musicians, because most of the times they don't think, for example, that they are being creative. But if we look at jazz improvisers, when they are improvising, every time they improvise, they create something novel. And we as a society, we don't see that as that impactful, but there is actually creativity there. And during my PhD, for example, I did a dynamic brain analysis where we looked through different processes of during jazz improvisation and different jazz improvisation techniques to see if it was like the default mode network, if it was the executive control network, and in each step of the improvisation, it was mostly common. And I think the mind wandering, which is very related with the default mode network, has a good point on that we don't know yet. But yeah, just wanted to add this because it's a big war, right? So there is plenty of stuff to still to explore and to understand.
Yes, thank you. And then I mentioned earlier, I'm new to this literature, so it's wonderful that you mentioned all this. Thanks.
Just to add on to the idea that maybe we should talk of creativity as a 4E process, Patricia just wrote a paper on can eating make us creative? Again, following on to that idea that, you know, it's not just the mind on itself that does it. There's something in the environment that allows you to go into that explorative space. And I've shared the link in the chat.
Thank you.
That's great.
Other questions or comments? Well, Peter, thanks a lot, not just for giving a great talk, but also sparking a wonderful discussion. Hopefully we can follow up in person-to-person space soon. And Peter is going to be around for the next couple of years, so there is no need to empty and solve all the questions right away, but this is certainly something to be continued also in the fall and also under the realm of the creativity theme of the IMC. Next week, we will have a number of the seed funding projects presenting. So I hope to see you again, some of you next week at the same time. Thanks, Peter, and take care.
Thank you very much. Thanks.